I'm Bart Everson. This will be a very quick and easy introduction to HTML. But first, a little review. The idea of hypertext originates from the fact that our documents don't really exist in pristine isolation, but they exist in a kind of universe of documents. And usually they're making reference to other documents. Wouldn't it be nice if we could just link directly from one document to another? That's the idea of hypertext. Probably the most significant hypertext system ever invented was World Wide Web, all one word, invented by Tim Berners-Lee in 1990 when he was working at the particle accelerator facility in Europe, CERN. And he devised a hypertext system which featured network distribution. So it was not just on one machine, but across a whole network, and built with an open architecture so people could add to it and extend it. And significantly, he put all this work in the public domain for the common good. Now, there's two pieces of software that are crucial to this idea: a client, what we now would generally call a browser, a web browser, and a server, or a web server. The client-server relationship is kind of at the heart of this model. The client makes a request to the server responds. Very simple. But that's not all. We have to specify exactly how this communication takes place. And so Tim Berners-Lee came up with HTTP. That's right, the Hypertext Transfer Protocol, the way that this communication is going to take place. A lot of times today you'll see HTTPS as well, the S being added on the end as we put more of a focus on encrypting these transactions between client and server. It just stands for secure. What's being sent back and forth, of course, is usually a document. The server is usually sending a document to the client, a web page a lot of the time. A web page, which is written in a language called HTML. It stands for Hypertext Markup Language, and that's what we'll be getting into in a moment. Now, as I mentioned earlier, this is distributed over the network. So where exactly is this document that we're looking for? You're sending a request. How do we find the document? That's another thing that Tim Berners-Lee had to specify. He came up with the idea of a URL. To locate this document, we'd have a uniform resource locator. Basically, something like this. This is a classic URL. This would have been for a page on the Xavier web server once upon a time. Very familiar, but let's break it down into its components. First of all, we have the service, as mentioned, the Hypertext Transfer Protocol, followed by a colon and 2 slashes. The host is next. That's the name of the server. In this case, www.xula.edu. And finally, the file details. In this case, it specifies that we're going to be looking in a directory or folder called ITC. And within that directory, we're looking for a file named help with the extension .html, help.html. And of course, these URLs can take different forms. We could specify different servers or subdomains even within the same domain of Xavier. And we won't get into the details of what all this means right now. It should be noted, though, that URLs, generally speaking, should not have spaces. They should not have special characters with diacritical marks. You can have these, but they have to be encoded, and that gets complicated. So getting on to HTML itself, it stands for hypertext, a way, as we've mentioned, of linking documents. It stands for markup. That's where we're going to take plain old text and mark it up with special formatting code. It stands for language. It is a language, a computer language, which has its own syntax and vocabulary. But note that it's not an executable language. It's a declarative language. It doesn't actually do anything most of the time. It's just going to state how things are. So it's really kind of a simpler language as far as computer languages go. Simpler, perhaps a little bit easier to learn, somewhat forgiving. You can judge for yourself. Now, usually when we're talking about HTML, we're talking about HTML documents or web pages. They are, that is, that each HTML document is a file that sits on a file system somewhere. We can be more specific and say that really it's a text file. It might have multimedia components, but those can be separate. The web page itself is a text file, often containing references to other files, as we've said. So we could say that it is a hypertext file. Images are separate files. So forgive me if I'm belaboring the obvious, but if you've got a web page with a frowny face and a smiley face in it, two separate images, then you're talking about three files, okay? You've got the web page itself, which is, as mentioned, a text file, and then you have the two image files. Now, the file name itself for a web page should probably end with .html or .htm. There are other things as well, but those are the safe ones for the beginner. Now, HTML documents are going to be viewed in a web browser. Here's a screenshot of an antique web browser, the Netscape web browser. This screenshot is from 1999 or 2000 when I first started trying to teach people about this. The browser reads the HTML file and it interprets any text between pointy brackets as code. Okay? Other text that's not between brackets will be read as content. So the stuff between the brackets, between the pointy brackets, that's special formatting instructions. It's not to be displayed in the browser. The other text, the stuff that's not in the brackets, is the text that is to be displayed or rendered. It's the content. And that will be displayed according to the special formatting instructions in the pointy brackets. I know you're probably wondering, what does this actually look like? I'm getting there. But first, we do have to mention the browser wars. 1995 to 2001, it was Netscape versus Internet Explorer. And this was kind of a mixed blessing. There were some good things. There was a lot of innovation that came out of this war between these two browsers. Actually, there were other browsers. These were just the biggest ones. And there was also, though, browser-specific HTML. In other words, HTML that worked in some browsers but not in others. Didn't work in the same way. It was inconsistent. It was maddening. And this was not a good thing. That led, though, to the importance of standards. We had to have web standards that would allow the web to develop and flourish in a predictable way. And this is what happened. This is what came out of the browser war. HTML finally got us to where we are today with HTML5. The World Wide Web Consortium, still says coalition. This should say, pardon me, is the World Wide Web Consortium, the W3C. I'm a little confused sometimes about the actual name of the thing. They came up with some standards, started specifying standards. 2.0, 3.2, HTML4. This was the big revolutionary one. It was simpler. It provided a logical structure for a document, and it did not provide, notably did not provide for the presentation, the appearance, the style of a web page. That would be dealt with in another way we'll talk about in a later point here. So this required a new way of thinking for people who had been wading through the previous versions of HTML. After that, it was a little unclear what the future direction of the web would be, and XHTML kind of was promulgated for a bit. There's some people who reacted pretty strongly against XHTML. The WHATWIG was formed, the Web Hypertext Application Technology Working Group, a consortium of big internet players, Apple and Google and a lot of other groups, stakeholders, if you will. And that led to the second browser war, which raged from 2004 all the way right up to 2017. This was Internet Explorer versus Chrome. Some other browsers, but I think we all know who kind of came out on top at the end of this war. And at the same time, it led to the development of HTML5, which added some new tags, fine-tuned a number of things. May not have been as revolutionary as HTML4, but is kind of where the web stands today. A lot of improvements. The W3C has kind of faded a bit, and they have ceded authority over the HTML5 specification to the WWIG. And furthermore, it's a kind of continually updated standard, a living standard, if you will. So I think we're going to be with HTML version 5 for a while now. The basic syntax has remained the same. Markup, content, markup. So you see the stuff between pointy brackets, as I was talking about. That's, in this example, you see an opening tag and a closing tag. And the closing tag is denoted by that /. Looks a little different than a backslash. There is a difference on your keyboard. The / designates the closing tag. And here's an actual example then. HTML is easy. Between an opening paragraph tag and a closing paragraph tag. Just saying that this is a paragraph. And this is the basic container model. The containers may be nested, right? So we could expand this paragraph to include an emphasized phrase. HTML is pretty easy using the M tag, which stands for emphasis. You'll notice we have 2 opening tags, 2 closing tags, but they're nested, one within the other, nice and neat. Notice I could switch that around, switch the P and M tags at the end, but now I've got a situation where the paragraph tag is closed while the emphasis tag is still open. And that's not good. That would be improperly nested, invalid HTML. You want to avoid that. Furthermore, the outer tag, as I mentioned, is the paragraph tag. The inner tag is the emphasized phrase. Okay, that leads us to the anatomy of a web page. First, we'll look at the global structure and then some of the details. First of all, there should be some version information at the very beginning of the document saying what version of HTML we're using. And then an HTML wrapper, if you will, containing a head and body. The head of the HTML document will just have some meta information. The body is where the real content of the document will be found. Here's what it might actually look like. That opening tag is what an HTML5 document specification looks like. Then we have the opening HTML tag. We have the head of the document, including the title of the document. That's a requirement. All HTML documents should have a title in the head, if nothing else. And then in the body, in between the body tags, you'd have the actual content of the web page. Finally, at the very end, we close the HTML element. Let's take a look at an actual web page all about coffee. Let me get out of this full screen mode if I can, and just say, here we have a sample web page. It's got a number of different elements. We see that it has some headings, some subheadings, some paragraphs, a block quotation, maybe a couple of lists. Yes, an unordered list, a numbered list. When I say unordered, that's web talk for a bulleted list. We also see a table and some pre-formatted text, and even a little thing down there at the bottom you might not notice, but kind of a horizontal line across the bottom of the web page, and a little statement about who made this page. Nice, very, very nice. Now, anytime you're looking at a web page on the internet, you can see the source, the HTML source that makes it all happen. In Chrome, you can just go to the View menu, choose Developer, View Source, and it will pop open a little window, a new tab, showing you the HTML. You notice it uses syntax coloring, so all the stuff between the pointy brackets, all the formatting code, the HTML code, is shown in color. And only the text content of the page is shown in plain old black text. Anytime you see something on the web and you want to see how it's being done via HTML code, it's open for you to peruse. I even have created a little graphic to show the anatomy of a web page. On the left here, you can see the web page we've just been looking at, and on the right, you see the HTML code. And I've designated what each element is, and on the right-hand side, you can see the code that corresponds to each particular element. Now, all these elements are really block elements. If you kind of squint, you'll see that each element begins on its own new line. All web pages are formed out of these blocks. And blocks, just blocks of content. A block of content can contain other blocks. Remember the idea of nesting, one within another. These are things like paragraphs, headings, lists, tables, and so forth. The idea of a block, though, is always it begins on a new line. That's the easiest way to think of it. The big structure of a web page. A little syntax, though, will help here. We mentioned that container model earlier. I told you that that was the syntax. Well, I wasn't completely forthcoming because there is another model, and that is what we call the empty content model. You notice this tag doesn't have an opening tag and a closing tag. It just sits there all by itself. HR, what does it stand for? No, it's not human resources. It's a horizontal rule. This just makes a little horizontal line across the page. It doesn't need an opening tag and a closing tag. It just exists by itself. That's why we call it the empty content model. Sometimes you'll see it with a slash, a closing slash built in, just to show that it stands on its own. Now block elements are not enough. We also have inline elements. These are things that kind of create the smaller structure of a web page in the line of text. So these are things like phrases, emphasized phrase, a bold phrase, strong emphasis, italics, subscripts, superscripts, also things like images and links. We call them anchors sometimes. That's just web speak for links. A little more syntax. If you have an image tag, it's not enough just to say IMG, that's what the image tag is, but you have to have a little bit more information. You have to say what the image that you're referring to is. And so we have to expand that image tag with what we call attributes. Most HTML elements can be expanded to include attributes, and they always follow this syntax, name and value. Name-value pairs. The name equals the value, which is given in quotes. So in the example here, we maybe have a web page called somepage.html. We have an image, the frown.gif image. So they're both in the same folder. Easy enough. The HTML would look something like this. We'd have an image tag with the source attribute equal to frown.gif. That would specify an image right in the same location as the web page itself, and the image would appear in the text of the web page. Now, things get a little more complicated depending on how the files are arranged in the folder relative to the web page. The images, you might have to do some fancy footwork to refer to them. I'm not going to get too in-depth on that right now. We also have links. I remember I mentioned the A tag. A stands for anchor. This might be the quintessential element of HTML. After all, it wouldn't be hypertext if we didn't have links. We've got the opening anchor tag. We've got the hyperreference attribute, href. It's equal to the linked file, whatever you're linking to. In this case, we're linking to another HTML file. It's actually called another.html, but it could be almost anything. And we, of course, have the linked text. This is what actually would appear on the page itself as a clickable link for the user. And, of course, it could look, like I said, almost anything that you could be linking to. If we're in the third example I'm showing here, we have what's called a fully formed URL, starting with the HTTP and all that jazz. But we're not going to get too much in depth. Again, we're just skimming along the surface to teach you the very bare minimum of HTML. To sum up, in fact, we have the primary innovation of HTML going back to HTML4, almost 20 years ago from when I'm speaking now. The logical structure is separated from the appearance. We're going to use HTML to designate the structure of web pages. We're going to use something else, style sheets, to govern their appearance. But that will be another lesson for another time. Once again, it's been my pleasure to share this information with you. I kind of feel like anybody who uses the web should have at least a basic understanding of HTML and not think of it as some kind of strange alien language, even if it is. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to me. Thank you, and hope you enjoyed this.